For the children of America, December 6th, 1941, was a Saturday. It was a day of stickball in the streets of Brooklyn, of chores on an Iowa farm, of radio serials and nickel matinees. The war in Europe was a distant, crackling voice on the wireless, a somber newsreel seen before the cartoons. But on December 7th, that world ended. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just an attack on a naval base, it was an assault on the American family. As fathers, uncles, and older brothers lined up at recruiting stations, a new, unspoken question settled over the nation's youth. What can we do? They would soon find their answer. The United States government didn't just ask for the help of its children, it actively mobilized them. They were to become the youngest soldiers on the home front, fighting a war not with guns, but with patriotism, sacrifice, and relentless, tireless effort. The first battlefield for America's children was the schoolhouse. Overnight, lessons changed. The Pledge of Allegiance, once a simple morning routine, was now recited with a new, solemn fervor. Maps of the Pacific and Europe were pulled down over maps of the United States. Teachers led students in patriotic songs and explained the news from the front. But the most visible change was the air raid drill. The screech of a siren would send children scrambling from their desks, filing into the hallways to kneel, heads down, hands clasped behind their necks. In coastal cities, they practiced duck and cover, learning which part of the school was safest from imagined bombs and flying glass. This wasn't a game. It was a deadly serious preparation for an enemy they were told could appear at any time. It was the first lesson of a new reality. The war was not over there. It was right here. President Roosevelt declared that America would be the arsenal of democracy, but an arsenal needs raw materials. Steel, aluminum, and copper were the building blocks of victory, and the nation was running short. The call went out to the children. They became scrap sentinels, organizing massive collection drives. They went door to door, pulling wagons, collecting anything made of metal. No contribution was too small. Old pots, rusty pans, broken toys, bicycle frames, and even garden gates were joyfully sacrificed. Newspapers ran contests, pitting schools and neighborhoods against each other. These mountains of metal were more than just scrap. They were a tangible link to the war. The children were told that their old toy soldier might become a bullet, their wagon a part of a tank. This was their first, most physical contribution to the fight. The drives didn't stop at metal. Rubber was one of the most critical shortages. With Japanese forces occupying the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia, every old tire, garden hose, and rubber boot was essential. Children scoured their homes and neighborhoods, dragging back victory rubber to collection depots. But perhaps the strangest request was for kitchen fats. Housewives were instructed to save every drop of bacon grease and cooking oil in a tin can. Children would then collect the cans and bring them to the local butcher. Why? Because the glycerin in the fat was a key ingredient in making explosives like dynamite and nitroglycerin. In the same vein, paper drives collected old newspapers and magazines for packing materials, and rag drives collected cloth for wiping down machinery in factories. Every piece of American trash was transformed into a weapon of war. How could a child with a 5-cent weekly allowance help fund the most expensive war in history? The answer was the War Stamp Program. The government initiated a Schools at War program, distributing stamp books to millions of students. A single stamp could cost as little as 10 cents. Children would save their milk money or allowance, bringing their coins to school each week to buy a stamp from their teacher. They would then lick the stamp and place it in their book. This was a brilliant piece of psychological mobilization. It gave even the youngest child a direct personal stake in financing the war. It wasn't an abstract donation, it was a tangible purchase. They weren't just saving money, they were actively saving for the war, one dime at a time. The program's slogan was, "Lick a stamp and lick the Axis." The 10-cent stamps were just the beginning. The goal was to fill the book. A full book, holding $18.75 in stamps, could be exchanged for a $25 Series E war bond, which would mature in 10 years. This was a monumental achievement for a child. Owning a war bond was a badge of honor. It meant they had personally loaned money to the United States government. Schools held bond rallies, often featuring movie stars, war heroes, or local officials. Children who filled their books would have their names read aloud in assembly. The propaganda was clear. A bond could buy a parachute, a life raft, or ammunition. This program raised billions of dollars, but its true value was in making every child feel like a shareholder in the company of victory. They were investors in freedom. With so many farmers and agricultural workers drafted, and with so much food being shipped to soldiers and allies overseas, the nation faced a potential food crisis. The government's solution was the Victory Garden. Families were urged to plow up their backyards, flower beds, and even public parks to plant vegetables. Children were the primary workforce for these home gardens. They were soldiers of the soil, tasked with weeding, watering, and harvesting. Schools planted their own massive gardens, with different classes competing to grow the most produce. This effort was astoundingly successful. By 1944, nearly 20 million victory gardens were in operation, producing over 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. It was a domestic triumph, one built on the sore backs and calloused hands of America's children, who were learning that patriotism could be grown, one tomato at a time. In a war fought on so many fronts, symbols were crucial. The most powerful symbol of the home front was the letter V for victory. It was everywhere. It was chalked on sidewalks, painted on fences, and formed the basis of popular songs. For children, the V was a constant companion. They learned to tap out its rhythm in Morse code, 3 dots and a dash, the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. They drew it in their school notebooks, often entwined with the American flag. The V was a symbol of defiance, unity, and an assurance of the eventual outcome. It was a way for a child, walking to school, to feel connected to a bomber pilot over Germany or a Marine on a Pacific island. It was a simple, universal, and powerful reminder of what they were all working for. While some children collected scrap, others joined the American Junior Red Cross. This organization put children's hands to work in a different way, providing comfort. Millions of members, primarily girls, learned to knit. They made scarves, socks, and sweaters for servicemen in cold climates. They assembled comfort kits to be given to soldiers, sailors, and wounded men in hospitals. These kits were small but meaningful, containing items like soap, a writing tablet, pencils, a sewing kit, and a deck of cards. The Junior Red Cross also ran first aid training in schools, teaching children basic bandaging and emergency response, again reinforcing the idea that they needed to be prepared for the war to come home. It was a massive, organized effort to channel youthful energy into acts of care and compassion, a soft counterpoint to the harsh realities of scrap drives and air raid drills. For a child in wartime America, the word no became a fact of life. To ensure fair distribution of scarce resources, the government implemented a strict rationing system. Every man, woman, and child was issued a ration book filled with stamps. These stamps were a second form of currency, required to buy sugar, coffee, meat, butter, cheese, and gasoline. For children, this meant no more casual candy bars or bubble gum. Sugar was precious. A birthday cake was a major logistical victory. They learned that share and play fair wasn't just a kindergarten rule, it was a national policy. This sacrifice was perhaps the most difficult, a daily nagging reminder of the war's cost. It taught an entire generation the hard lessons of conservation, delayed gratification, and the difference between what they wanted and what the country needed. While younger children collected stamps, older teenagers were eager for more direct involvement. For many, the answer was the Civil Air Patrol Cadet Program. Founded just days before Pearl Harbor, the CAP was a civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Teenagers, some as young as 15, could join as cadets. They wore uniforms, learned military drill, and studied aviation. But this was no after-school club. These cadets performed vital wartime duties. They worked as messengers on military bases, helped plot aircraft movements in spotting centers, and assisted with search and rescue operations. In coastal areas, they were the eyes and ears of the anti-submarine patrol. For these young Americans, it was a direct bridge between childhood and the adult world of military service, a chance to wear a uniform and serve in a tangible, high-stakes role. The psychological front was just as important as the home front. Keeping up the morale of the 16 million Americans in uniform was a national priority. Children were central to this effort. They were encouraged, both at home and at school, to write letters to family members and even to soldiers they didn't know. The most common form was V-mail or victory mail. Letters were written on special stationery, which was then photographed, reduced to microfilm, flown overseas, and printed back out at its destination. This saved millions of tons of shipping space. For a soldier in a foxhole, a child's letter, with its simple news of a good report card, a new puppy, or a successful scrap drive, was a powerful, precious link to the world he was fighting to protect. The government knew it needed to win the hearts and minds of its youngest citizens. The Office of War Information, along with private industry, unleashed a torrent of propaganda aimed directly at children. Comic book heroes like Superman, Batman, and Captain America spent less time fighting supervillains and more time battling Nazis and Japs. Popular cartoon characters, including Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck, starred in animated shorts urging kids to buy war stamps or save their grease. Posters in school hallways and post offices depicted children as junior commandos and essential partners in victory. This media blitz was incredibly effective. It framed the war in simple moral terms, good versus absolute evil, and made every child's contribution, no matter how small, feel like a heroic act. Organizations like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America were mobilized almost instantly. These existing uniformed groups were a perfect auxiliary workforce. Boy Scouts took on dozens of roles. They acted as messengers for civil defense officers, distributed posters, and conducted massive collection drives, using their well-organized troop structure to great effect. They were trained in first aid and emergency signaling. On the coasts, older Sea Scouts assisted the Coast Guard with coastal patrols, watching for U-boats. Girl Scouts, meanwhile, focused heavily on the home. They tended victory gardens, ran brownie troops for younger girls whose mothers were in factories, and trained in childcare and nutrition. For the Scouts, their motto, "Be prepared," had suddenly taken on a new, urgent, and very real meaning. The war fundamentally altered the American family. With over 16 million men in the service and millions of women, Rosie the Riveter, going to work in defense plants, homes across the country fell silent during the day. This gave rise to a new social phenomenon, the latchkey kid. These were children who came home from school to an empty house, letting themselves in with a key they often wore on a string around their necks. They were responsible for starting their homework, fixing their own snacks, and often for caring for their younger siblings until their mother returned, exhausted, from her shift. This forced a level of independence and maturity on children at a very young age. They learned to be self-sufficient, responsible, and resilient, becoming the quiet, unheralded managers of the American household. Unlike previous generations, the children of World War II saw the war in pictures. Before every feature film, theaters ran newsreels. These were dramatic, heavily narrated segments showing grainy, black-and-white footage from the front lines. Children saw tanks rolling through ruined French towns, anti-aircraft guns firing in the night sky, and lines of grim-faced soldiers marching to the front. At home, radio announcers like Edward R. Murrow broadcast live from London during the Blitz. Newspapers printed maps with arrows showing Allied advances. For children, this constant stream of information made the war immediate and terrifyingly real. They learned geography from casualty lists and headlines, and they grew up with a global awareness and a sober maturity that no generation before them had ever possessed. For too many children, the war's ultimate sacrifice was not an abstract concept. It arrived in a telegram. Throughout the war, a common sight in American neighborhoods was the service flag, a small banner with a blue star for each family member serving in the armed forces. The nation collectively held its breath, praying those stars remained blue. But when a serviceman was killed, the blue star was replaced by a gold star. For a child, seeing that gold star appear in a neighbor's window, or devastatingly in their own, was a shattering, definitive moment. It was the instant the war ceased to be an adventure of scrap drives and stamps and became a permanent, painful loss. This was the final, terrible price of victory, a price paid by children who would now grow up without a father or a brother. Inevitably, the war seeped into every aspect of life, including playtime. The games children played reflected the world around them. War became the new cowboys and Indians. Neighborhood boys, armed with wooden sticks for rifles and pot lids for shields, reenacted battles they read about in the papers. Model building, always a popular hobby, took on a new purpose. Children weren't just building planes, they were building models of Spitfires, Messerschmitts, and Zeros, learning to identify enemy and friendly aircraft, just in case. Toy soldiers were no longer the redcoats of the Revolution, they were olive-drab GIS. This wasn't just play, it was a way for children to process the anxieties of the adult world, to feel a sense of control, and to rehearse the roles they, too, might one day be called upon to play. When VE Day arrived in May 1945, followed by VJ Day in August, the nation erupted in a euphoric celebration that had been building for 4 long years. For the children, it was a release of tension they had carried for nearly their entire conscious lives. They paraded in the streets, waved flags, and cheered until they were hoarse. The air raid sirens, once a sound of terror, now screamed in triumph. The blackout curtains were torn down, letting light flood back into their homes. This was the victory they had worked for. They had collected the scrap that built the tanks, bought the stamps that funded the armies, and grown the food that fed the soldiers. They had sacrificed their candy, their toys, and in many cases, their fathers. The war was over, and they knew with absolute certainty that they had helped win it. The children of World War II grew up to be what Tom Brokaw would later call the greatest generation. But their greatness was forged in childhood. The war had been the defining event of their youth. It taught them lessons no classroom ever could: unity, sacrifice, deferred gratification, and the power of a single, unified national purpose. They learned that every individual, no matter how small, had a part to play. They had seen the best and worst of humanity before they were old enough to drive. This shared experience, this trial by fire on the home front, bonded them forever. They were the children who had, quite literally, built the arsenal of democracy, and in doing so, they had built the foundation for the prosperous, powerful, and free America that would emerge from the ashes of the war.